Today's webinar topic is proactively building security controls for DevSecOps. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Raquel Rodriguez, the events manager here at Security Compass and your host for today's webinar. Before we get started with the actual content, I'd like to give you a quick overview of Security Compass. For those of you who may not be aware of us until today, Security Compass was founded in 2004 and began with a team of experienced penetration testers. Today, we have come far and work with many large enterprises globally to manage their cybersecurity risk through balanced development automation. We have three key offerings. Our flagship product, SD Elements, enables organizations to deliver software quickly and reduce costs through automation. Our modular role-based e-learning solutions empower organizations to embrace DevSecOps, and our strategic advisory services offer expertise in cloud security, pen testing, and red teaming for a better security posture. Let's quickly go through some housekeeping items. As you might notice, you've all entered the session on mute to reduce background noise. Second, a recording of this webinar will be available after today's event, and you will receive an email with a link to the recording. We will also publish the recording in the resources section of our website. Also, we encourage everyone to raise questions. Please submit your questions into the Q&A chat and we'll address them during the Q&A session. If after our session you'd like to follow up with us, or you have a topic you'd like to see covered in a future session, please email us at contact@securitycompass.com. Like I mentioned, for today's webinar, our topic is proactively building security controls for DevSecOps. I'm pleased to have here with me Altaz, Director of Insights Research at Security Compass, Spencer, Security Wizard at Reddit, and Dhruv, Head of Cloud Governance and Compliance at RBC. Spencer, Dhruv, and Altaz, thank you so much for being here with me today. I know our audience is eager to hear your presentation, so I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Raquel. Appreciate that. Bear with me as I go in and just quickly share a whiteboard here. And just as Raquel had mentioned, please don't hesitate. If you've got any questions, bring them up. We're more than happy to take them as we go through our conversation today. So the topic is about proactively building security controls in DevSecOps. And what we're going to do is talk about how we identify the security controls, how we then move over to operationalizing these controls, any challenges that we may have faced in trying to implement these controls, and where we headed in the future. So we'll be having a conversation with our panelists today, and I'd like to kick it off just initially from the identification of the right security controls in a DevSecOps context. So Spencer, I'll start with you. In your experience, when you've had to initially, before even operationalizing security controls, you have to consider the direction that you're going in and identify what security controls are important. What are some things that you did that you found to be really useful when it came to the identification stage of these controls, very early in the life cycle of the controls?
Yeah, so I think one of the best things to do is to figure out some sort of rubric or framework to align yourself against. It's really hard to start from scratch. And so like if you take the OWASP SAM, that's probably the best framework that you can align this to. That I know that I've used that personally in the past and kind of helps structure how you can have a conversation with your leadership, how you can have a conversation with the CTO levels of here's how we want to frame what we want to do. Now, there's a lot of boxes that are on that framework chart. Not every box is a great fit for every org. And so probably the other thing, besides getting your framework lined up, is to figure out how your environment actually functions. If you're brand new or if you're walking in the door and you're trying to figure out, how is this going to actually work? Understanding the current state and understanding how your IT organization actually does just regular DevOps, forget the security component of it, just figure out how it flows, because that's going to be one of the other things, is that you don't want to have this grandiose idea of how you want to implement security controls if they're never going to work, if you're going to be breaking developers' flow, if you're going to be adding in friction. These are all things that will cause your efforts to add security controls to just completely crater. So understanding what the current environment looks like, the tools, the technologies, what you're using for source code management, what you're using for CI/CD, All of those things are extremely important to get quantified, to get inventoried, and then now you can start figuring out what's the best idea, or what's the right place to start selecting those security controls.
Interesting. And Dhruv, what's been your experience when you've had to kick off this idea of building security controls? Before you do anything, how do you go about prioritizing? Like, what were some of the, from your experience, some of the things that you've discovered? Sorry, you're on mute. No, doesn't look like your sound is working. Yeah. So while Dhruv's working on his microphone there, I guess Spencer, looking at the whole idea of DevSecOps and the context, I think becomes a key thing. And oftentimes we jump into trying to identify the security controls without understanding the context of how everything is going to work together. And therein lies in the future some challenges where we may discover that we had the best of intentions, but because we haven't thought through how this is going to work in the context that we are working within, that becomes a challenge at that point. And so teams now are in fact unable to implement or even incorporate some of the controls that we're thinking about. In terms of the rubrics and the frameworks, from your experience, have you found that these rubrics and frameworks incorporate the idea of trying to identify your context, or is it something that comes only from experience where, yes, we'll follow the rubric and the framework, but understanding the context is a separate thing that we have to do before we get to the rubrics and the frameworks?
Yeah, I think they're written in a way so that it's relatively agnostic. I know the new OWASP SAM went through a great effort of trying to modernize and like strip out a lot of the old trappings that existed. And so, being able to read that framework, it's definitely like a governance type mentality where it's okay if you don't know what that context might be. And I think, I've certainly asked like my engineering teams, like, how exactly does this thing work? Because I might be net new, like Reddit uses drone CI. I've never used drone CI anywhere. And so it's an interesting, evolution of, okay, how exactly does this thing work? But it's kind of, I joke with other security architects, like the technology may change, but the concepts are still fundamentally the same, right? So I know if I've got a CI pipeline, I know I want to add tests. There's probably a way to do that in drone. It's YAML or Starlark configurations, and you're adding in those things that you need to get done. You're just changing the implementation or the underlying details, but the concepts are still the same. So I think that's what I would definitely focus on. And then if you've been doing DevSecOps and you kind of know this space, it's pretty easy to switch from one technology to another, because things might be called different things. The way that pipelines are built within Jenkins is drastically different than in drone CI, but the concepts are still the same. So you just have to relearn the taxonomy, but the rubric is still going to point you in the right direction. If you want to do testing, you've got a plethora of tests that could be done. So I don't think that's necessarily a challenge, but it definitely requires some intelligence on our part to be able to connect those dots.
Yeah, that's great. Dhruv, I noticed that you're back. Are you able to provide some thoughts on identification of the controls? Sorry, Dhruv, you're on mute.
Unmute. Hello?
Yeah, loud and clear.
Okay, fantastic. Perfect. So working in technology for past 20 plus years, I still have to figure out how Zoom works.
We're all there. It's all good.
That's all good. That's all good. So to identify, I think Spencer captured the information very succinctly. Rather than reinventing the wheel, there are already existing frameworks that we can leverage from. And I totally agree that a bit of curation is required depending on the kind of organization you are, whether you're a small organization, a large organization, a federally regulated organization. do you have a huge technology stack or a relatively nimble technology stack? All those aspects are taken into consideration. But I think you start off with what exists. And over a period of time, you curate. One of the challenges that exist, sorry, I'm going to the challenges column. One of the challenges that exist is that people expect, or organizations expect, perfection at the very first go, which is almost impossible to achieve. And that goes into what we call analysis paralysis. You know, everybody has brilliant opinions, and that is the problem, that everybody has brilliant opinions. It would be great if people did not, because that you can negate. And you get into this rabbit hole after rabbit hole after rabbit hole. So you start off with whatever exists, you curate it over a period of time, and you achieve somewhat perfection, right? Which is almost unachievable. But I think it aligns with exactly what Spencer mentioned. And of course, you're talking about tools and technologies and stuff. None of the tools and technologies will give you absolutely everything. Large organizations have a tendency of buying one product and then one more product and yet another product, and now they have 16, and they do not know how to amalgamate these 16 products together. You start off with one, you do a good job at it, stick to it, improve on it, and then move forward.
Yeah. So let me push a little bit further. We talk about identification. We talk about understanding the context. Who do you talk to go in there and try and understand this context? Are there material that you read? Do you reach out to certain people, you know, in the IT space, find out what they're doing, talk to the devs? Dhruv, I'll start with you on this one.
I think you have to speak to everybody. You can't do it in a silo. You can't talk to the decision makers and the people who have the deep pockets to actually do things and push the initiative forward. You have to talk to developers, you know, understand what their concerns are, develop a plane, and making sure that developers can get the tools and technologies and, you know, get them to sing together, because developers have their own little likes and dislikes, right? So you want to give them a technology stack that a lot of people can use and leverage. You have to talk to security, certainly, because they have their opinions. You have to start bringing them together before you start throwing a project at them. You know, you can't say that here's a project, you are 15 people here, get it going. You say, well, you never spoke with me before, and you never actually gave us that context and picture. So you have to speak to the security folks, you have to speak to the developers, you have to understand the business aspect and the business needs, because there's always this healthy tension, I would say, between the business folks and the technology folks, where both of them believe that they are be all end all of an organization. Well, it's not true. They both are needed in equal capabilities. So you have to bring them together first. So you have to speak to everybody, including individuals such as the client. You know,
yeah.
So is this what you want? And I think if you have that conversation very well structured and laid out and consolidated, I think development would become much easier.
Mm-hmm. And so here, what you're suggesting is that it really is more of a facilitative role initially. Let's bring everybody together. Let's talk about what we're trying to achieve. There's some strategy somewhere, and we're looking for ways to enable that strategy, the business strategy, the IT strategy, right? So we're enabling rather than blocking when we talk about controls. Spencer, your thoughts? Who do you talk to? How do you gather people together initially?
Yeah, I mean, Dhruv is right. Like, you kind of do have to talk to everybody, because there's so many different aspects within DevSecOps that if you just go in with like, here's your grandiose plan, it more than likely will find a snag because somebody will complain about it. On the flip side, there is the, you know, death by committee. There is that kind of concept, but I think, you know, there's a lot of things that you could do in a DevSecOps world. And certain things are focused on like your cloud security or your cloud engineering folks, or your release engineering, or developers themselves. And so, you know, it's great to have this overall strategy, but focusing, like, helping to drive the narrative of, okay, I'm going to talk to the development team, and we're going to talk about how, you know, we might have IDE integrations, we might be wanting to put in SaaS or DaaS type tooling, having those discussions with the targeted audiences that it makes sense with are very important, rather than just kind of saying like, here's this overall plan. Do you agree with it? Yes or no? Because some people might have no idea what you're talking about. Some people might not care. Some people might just be out to give feedback because, you know, that's the kind of personality they've got. But I think you definitely need to pick and choose who you're going to be getting feedback on. And I think the other thing I'll recommend too is that you don't necessarily have to get 100% buy-in. And there's gonna be a lot of reluctance anyway, because people hate change. Like, change is bad always, right? So iterating and starting extremely small. Like, I've had really good success by just picking out, just do dependency management as like the most easy thing to include. It's not destructive to a pipeline. It's pretty cheap too. Like, just get that bare minimum and see how it tastes. Get a feeling for, well, we're gonna put it in. Now we have data, which now we can do things with, because people love to be able to see, I need to do this thing because this data exists. And it's, you know, it's those small incremental changes that will then scale up into, okay, now we can actually have like a DevSecOps program, because you started with, well, let's try this one thing that actually works. So it is kind of a balancing act, and you kind of have to know when to hold them and when to fold them, if you will. But definitely that approach where you say, we want to get to this DevSecOps nirvana as a security person, and then laying out, here's the iterative steps to go, like small change, bigger, and ramp that growth. There's a lot of, you know, that momentum of implementing a program. You want to start with a good experience and then keep going from there. And it's not to say that you're going to hit failures. Like maybe you try a tech stack that doesn't work. I think this is very much like in the engineering world. You try things, and if they don't work, you just gut it. Like, no hard feelings. Like, it's just not going to work out. Switch the tact and try again. I think that the fallacy that you don't want to fall into, though, is picking a product and saying this is what it's going to be, and then trying to make it work. Almost never works out. So you do kind of have to walk that balancing line as well.
Interesting. You know, many times when we look at kind of how things roll out in the conversations that I've had, security teams will come out and say, well, we've kind of inherited this mess. You know, there was a kludgy security solution put in place. It was all about trying to get things out really quickly. There was no real clear, you know, leadership and guidance on creating a security program. And I like what both of you have suggested, which is look for an area where you can go in, start somewhere, and then kind of grow from that stage, rather than trying to come in and saying, let's try and put this whole thing and we're here to solve everybody's problems all at once. It's very difficult to do that. And I think this is a good segue now to the second part of this conversation, which is around operationalizing. So we talked about iterating, we talked about starting small, we talked about making this contextual to the audience. So one question that I have, and we'll start with you, Spencer, this time. How do you achieve an alignment when it comes time to operationalize your security controls? Because after all, this is now going to get measured. It's going to be extracted from systems. But how do you achieve alignment across all these stakeholders?
Yeah, and I think this is, like, operationalization is a tricky word too, because, you know, most security teams are either like understaffed or underfunded, or, you know, like there's way more developers than there are security people, right? And so operationalization, like the first hurdle for me is, how do you get to that scale? So you're picking technologies that are high signal to noise ratio. So you're getting good results out of it, and you're rolling that out. You know, I've been in plenty of shops that are like, well, we're going to put in SaaS and we're going to hire a consulting firm to just churn through those false positives and that security. That does check the box. So if you're regulatory and you have to do that, cool, do it. But if you're looking for, like, am I going to fix a lot of phones? That's probably not the best way. So I think, you know, that operationalization has to have a concept of, well, if I've got AppSec folks waiting in the wings, how can I best use those technologies to reduce the security risk that might be present in my product, right? So that's kind of the first problem. And then making sure, like, I do surveys, I'll do feedback from teams of, we implemented this thing, how's it going, right? If there's not a good feel for if developers like the tool, or if if they're like, well, I don't really trust it, or I just hit the ignore button on everything, then something went wrong. Like you need to spend some time to re-engineer, like I know hearts and minds is kind of the buzzword that people use for that, right? Like, but you do need to do something. And so I think tracking, not only like, are you finding vulns, which is good, like that's at the end of the day, that's what every security person is looking for, is reducing those vulns. But then is it effective? Do people like it? Are you introducing friction into the environment? Like you need to take those things into consideration too when you do the operationalization, because otherwise that's how programs fall apart, honestly.
Absolutely. And this is part of managing the change as you start to unfold it. There are things, and we'll talk about all this later on, but how do we now go in and make sure that we've got the people to buy into this idea as we start to get some lift? So Dhruv, on your side, as you look at operationalizing this, how have you worked at trying to achieve alignment or consensus across all these different stakeholders?
So so first of all, very well put, Spencer. Thanks for that. So day two is very important for a bank, or for that matter, for any other organization. So our approach has always been talk to everybody, talk to the operational team, try to understand what their current challenges are. Do they even understand the nuances of new tools and technologies that are coming and being thrown at them? Cloud native technologies, DevSecOps. What do these mean? You've suddenly put a fancy set of tools, and you've not ensured that they speak the same language. You've not ensured they understand where the organization is trying to go. They don't understand or don't have subject matter expertise. So you actually have to start talking to them and then bringing them up to speed and educating them and training them where required, wherever those gaps exist. Once you have that buy-in, day two becomes a little more seamless. But otherwise, developers would be developing all these fancy tools and technologies. Business wants to push it forward, and suddenly day two happens. It says, oh, we built it, but who's going to run it? Who's going to keep the lights on, right? And the day two folks say, yeah, but you've done something. It doesn't adhere to our standards. It doesn't adhere to what we know. You've given us a bunch of new tools, and again, underfunded all the time. It is odd to be in security. It's a well-paying field, but we have the least amount of resources. But I think the world is changing. I think the world really is changing as the cloud is moving forward. I have a lot of hope that businesses have started to focus on information security, data, and privacy.
I agree.
Yeah.
That is a trend that I'm actually seeing. So InfoSec is in fact on the rise at this point, and it's becoming, we'll talk about that. It's becoming more and more part of the focus of the conversations that I'm engaged in as well. So, now we've talked about trying to get everybody together, make sure that as we roll this out and we're operationalizing this, it's contextual to the audience itself. And inevitably, we're going to get down to tools. Okay, operationalizing it implies tools. How do you make a decision on what tools to use, what tools not to use? Dhruv, let's start with you.
There's a political answer, and then there is a non-political answer. Non-political answer is whatever the standard says. And standards sometimes can be very prescriptive, right? So,
yes.
So it's like bringing religion and politics into one, right? So you keep them separate. Standards should never be prescriptive on tools. How to define tools? Again, I think I alluded to it a wee bit before. All tools are decent. Some tools are a wee bit better than the others. But let's not get into a situation where you run towards the most shiny object. The cloud native tools are great, and I don't want to name the tools. I could very well name them. I don't want to name the cloud service providers. They all have similar kind of capabilities and tool sets. Start off with one. And work with your standards team. Make sure that they reduce the prescriptiveness on their standards and say that, thou shall use this approved tool and technology. Well, sometimes that does not work in the new environment. Sometimes it does not work in cloud. Again, I can give you horror stories, which I'm not going to, but start off small, speak to your standards people, reduce the prescriptiveness, choose one and give it a full go rather than crumple the paper up just because you cannot make a Picasso the first go, right? And if you've seen Picasso, like even after like hundreds of go, the eyes are always messed up than the face and the lips and the noses, right? So it doesn't matter.
I hear you. Spencer, your thoughts on tools?
Yeah, I think, so as much as I hate to say it, like the value of the POC is extremely important, right? But it also does take a lot of time. So I think when I evaluate a tool, I'm first most thinking like, okay, is it going to achieve the objective that I want to get out of it as a security person? But then how does it mesh with my development team, with my infrastructure team, et cetera? So those are like the high rubric, right? And if it gives a good feel for folks and it achieves at least the objective that I know I want to achieve, might not necessarily be like Drew said, like it doesn't have to be every single thing because there is no perfect tool. As much as companies try to build up and acquire and build that perfect amalgamation of everything, doesn't quite exist yet. But I think that like giving it a go and seeing if it does work in the environment is extremely important. Like there's a lot of good insight that you'll get from that. I think one of the other things too that I've seen, it might not be as prevalent on the larger org side, starting with very easy open source products to get you an idea of what you can expect without having to do a whole lot of investment, right? So if I take like dependency management, for example, there's a lot of open source products that do dependency scanning against manifests. Like try it out and see what happens. Like maybe if you don't have experience with those tools, or if you don't know what the results might be, or if you don't know what to do with the results, those are good ways to kind of get an understanding of the process that will go into that tool. Because it's one thing to go and acquire a tool and then be like, okay, cool, we checked the box, we bought the product, standards guys are cool with this. It's another to then actually operationalize and make a process out of using that tool. So if you don't know what to do with the results, or if you get the results and now you don't know how to affect change, this is the thing that kills me in the industry is like, we have a lot of tools that are very geared towards security people, figuring out how many CVEs exist, right? I don't really care. What I do care about is how do I go from detection to remediation, right? Anything that helps to improve that or give me contextual data or help supplement how to make that happen is extremely valuable, right? Like if you're doing an RFP rubric of here are all the things that need to exist, that should be one of the top ones because it is such an important thing and it's so hard to get right. But, especially if you're a small AppSec team, it is extremely important because the shorter the window of trying to figure out, okay, well, I got this alert that came out of this product. What do I do now? Shortening that window helps, move on to the next one because there's always another thing, right?
Yeah, that's a key point. And in conversations that I've had with enterprise architects as well, ultimately this ties into the business value that you're providing, right? If we're going to acquire a tool, it is going to be a part of some process. And is it going to make the process more efficient? Is it going to make it lean? Is it going to allow us to be more resilient, to respond better? These are things that we start to kind of bring out. And this is where the metrics that are important to the business start to come in. Will these tools, as we operationalize these controls, are they going to provide us with the necessary feedback that we can go back to the business to say, hey, look, from a security perspective, we are doing our best in terms of providing the level of resiliency and the assurance that we're being as secure as we can be going forward. And understanding, of course, that no system is perfectly secure, but we are iterating, we're continually improving. And yet again, we've got this situation where it isn't just about one team. So if we're going to use a code scanner, for example, it's not just about the dev space, but what about those in ops, right? What controls are we going to put in there? and what tools are we going to put in there to make sure that they've also got the information they need, ultimately collecting this stuff to what Dhruv was talking about earlier, rather than having these data islands of security information all over the place. But how are we going to tell a story that conforms to the value proposition that the business is ultimately looking for, right? That's what's kind of missing here. Let's steer our conversation and look at the challenges now. Some of the things that we've already discussed. When we start to develop security controls, sometimes it doesn't fit the context. And there are many different contexts that we're working with. There's certainly the overall strategy of the organization, which we all hope to align to. But when it comes to interpretation of policies and things like that, sometimes it becomes challenging because there's some vagueness there. And somebody needs to come in and help understand how to interpret some of these things. There's the expectation of being perfect when you start. There's also this idea of forcing a product mindset that we talked about. We're just going to take a product, put it in, and it's going to make us more secure. And then trying to configure the product becomes a real challenge. There's this whole idea that I think we've heard a lot about, which is understaffing. There just aren't enough people out there. So Dhruv, from your standpoint, what other challenges have you seen as you've tried to incorporate security controls, right? So you've identified the controls, you've started to move forward with operationalizing it, but you've hit some snags along the way, right? What are some of these challenges?
One of the challenges that large organizations face is the concept of single pane of glass. It's an important concept. It needs to be done. You have to satisfy OSFI. You have to satisfy other regulatory entities. Now, the problem happens when the organization is large and relatively mature, a 150-year-old bank. And over these 150 years, it has collected diverse set of tools, technologies, processes, and procedures, and which seem to work. And suddenly comes a new being, which we call cloud or DevSecOps or SecOps or, concept of CI/CD pipeline. What is CI/CD pipeline? My God. What about change management? Like, what about cab and tab? But anyway, coming back to that single pane of glass, we are mandated to have something called a single pane of glass. With new tools and technologies, they don't play nice with existing single pane of glass.
Yes.
And that is one of the largest challenges. So what do? For a large organization, you can't clean up everything. You just can't say, oh, well, this doesn't seem to work with the new tools and technology, so should we have two single panes of glasses? Then it's not a single pane of glass. So that is one of the largest challenge a large organization faces. And I can assure you, having worked for 3 of the 5 banks on the street, I know that every one of them faces the same. And the other 2 that I haven't worked for yet, I shouldn't say this because this is being recorded, but also face exactly the same issue, right? So what then becomes a challenge is that you have to go back to the regulatory bodies and say that, guys, we can't do this. Or folks, we can't do this because of such and such reasons, but we are still managing to maintain the control aspect. We are still protecting the environment. Yes, your prescriptive statement of having a single pane of glass has shifted a little bit, but maybe it's not really required. So that should give you an idea of what one of the largest challenge we banks face on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, Spencer, your thoughts, challenges?
Yeah, I think to add on to the single pane of glass that Drew's talking about, I think there's also a concept around like a single pane of glass around vuln management. That's like one of the big challenges that I see on my side is you've got all of these disparate tools, you've got all of these good rich sources of data. How do you take all that stuff and cram it into one thing that is either like risk ranked in a similar fashion, or you're using the same metrics to evaluate the risk? Like, do you base off CDE? Do you make up your own? Do you come up with some qualitative, like thumbs up, thumbs down? Like that, I think that is a huge problem on the vuln management side too. That is kind of like a single pane of glass concept, but it's really hard to do, and it's very challenging. We already talked about being understaffed, it's hard to do without a lot of time too, because you are now talking about like doing data science stuff, like amalgamating all of these things into a data warehouse, normalizing all of them, getting a dashboard or some visualization out of it for an exec. Like that takes a lot of time. And you had to do the operational stuff. And now also this like data intelligence thing, that becomes very tricky too. But you also need it to understand what to do. So it's kind of like, a double-edged sword. You want that data, but then it's going to take you some time to figure out how to normalize those things and prioritize. If I've got things that are coming from a SAS scanner, things that are coming from a dependency checker, things that are coming from infrastructure as code for that team's pipeline, like I've got all of these different things. What are you going to have that team focus on first, right? And then, how are you going to divvy that across sprints for those teams to go and fix? I think a lot of those questions are, without having that prioritization risk ranked, you just kind of, and that you do kind of end up at the end of the day going based on professional expertise, making those recommendations. But it's super helpful to have, here's my data source to back up the things that I'm recommending.
Yeah, interesting. And there are, to what the two of you have brought up, there are so many new use cases that are emerging. We take a look at, like, for example, supply chain and stuff like that. It's you've got contractors, let's say. How are you going to manage the security controls when you're dealing with contractors, as an example? And these contractors may be organizations, not just individuals. Ensuring that they're conforming to the standards that you've set, and do this all in a way that still continues to keep the momentum moving forward, to move quickly, to get things out, to be innovative. These are real difficult and thorny problems. They sound great on paper as a policy to suggest that, across our pipelines, we're going to make sure that we're secure, but the actual implementation of those, it just has so many nuances attached to it. When you start to get to it, there may be different systems, different tools, and then trying to create a standard, and to your word that you were using, Spencer, around normalizing all of this, can be an enormous challenge to try and figure out, and this cannot stop. We have to still continue to kind of keep this forward momentum. Other challenges I'd like to bring up. What happens when, for example, a standard or a framework or something that is on the regulatory side changes? Speak to challenges around that. Spencer, I'll start with you.
Ooh, that's a good question. And this is why I love Reddit. Reddit doesn't have any standardization or any standards or industrial bodies to deal with yet. I think I guess, the standards are normally slow moving, right? Like if you look at the evolution of PCI DSS, which is probably the thing that I've had the most interaction with, you can kind of get ahead of it. You understand what's happening. You should have somebody, there should be an info risk, or at least like you're out there on the Twitter sphere figuring out what's the changes that are coming down the pipeline. Mm-hmm. So I feel like there's a way to get prepared. And then there's also a good, healthy amount of interpretation, because,
yes,
most of these standards are relatively high level, and from like a legal standpoint, pretty much it's always, do you have an antivirus and do you have a firewall? Well, it's 2020, and yeah, you can, like, are AWS security groups firewalls? Like, sure, yeah, that's going to be the definition. So I think there's a lot of interpretation that has to happen, especially as technology becomes more diverse, things get a lot harder to name and risk rank. So I think it's just getting ahead of understanding what those impacts are going to be, consulting with legal, consulting with risk if you've got a risk team, getting those stakeholders. And normally it's not that bad. I'm sure Drew has some interesting perspective, because I've never been on the bank side. I've only been energy and social media, so hasn't been too terrible. But it's just keeping it top of mind, making sure that you're able to have a good answer for when those standards do get released.
Mm-hmm. Drew, your thoughts?
No, exactly the same, actually. But the interesting experiences I've had, one of the things that I have noticed time and time again is that all these regulatory statements, they are not black. They are written black and white, but they are not really black and white. Sometimes, yes, like PCI DSS standard you mentioned, Spence, one of the things was key management. Who should own the key encryption key? A long time ago, it said that thou shalt own the key encrypting key. Now on AWS Key Vault or Azure Key Vault, how do you do that? Should you do BYOK? And if you do BYOK, it becomes brutally convoluted. And there are multiple touch points rather than having it automated within the cloud space. So I think the standards are changing, but if you interpret and if you implement that interpreted implementation of yours, then thou shall have some agreement, formalized sign-offs from all the stakeholders. At that point of time, none of the regulatory bodies would say, oh, wow, we said this, but you did this. As long as you can say, you said this, we interpreted it like this, we challenged it within our 3 lines of defenses, we got sign-offs from everybody, we understand the risk, here's our risk ranking and risk rating, here's it in our book of record, and this is how we are tracking it, the regulatory bodies will not pounce on you. They will accept it. But the problem becomes that you interpret something, you don't follow full due diligence, you don't get sign-off, you implement it, and then when the regulatory body comes in and audits you, you have a half-baked entity which looks like half animal, half human, and that really doesn't work, right? So if you've chosen to interpret it, complete the full due diligence, at which point of time it works.
Got it. So let's flip now and talk about the future. All right. So we spoke a little bit about how InfoSec is becoming more important. I'm hearing a lot more now about speed, risk, security, compliance, development. In my opinion, I think we've already seen the convergence of software development and compliance. Given how important that process is to the business and starting to inject now, how do we put in the necessary requirements to drive some of the compliance requirements so that we're not in breach becomes really important. But that's just one small aspect of this whole thing. There's much more to it, but I'd like to open it up and I'd like to ask you, Dhruv, like from your perspective, what are you seeing as it pertains to security controls, automation, AI, like where are we headed with all of this?
I think the keyword that keeps coming into our minds is privacy, right? And it all dovetails with information security, compliance, governance, oversight, how much oversight. So everything around privacy has started taking a lot of focus, and all the controls that we are developing and are mandated to deliver are privacy centric. And it creates a lot of challenges, right? There are issues such as GDPR is slightly different from CCPA, CCPA is slightly different from PIPEDA. The tools and technologies don't provide features so that you can do right to forget, like blockchain. You can't use blockchain on privacy. And the reason is that blockchain actually has the hash of previous interactions, which could actually have privacy information. So you can't actually use blockchain on any privacy related items, because then if you have the concept of right to forget from GDPR, you'll have to delete the entire chain, which will have repercussions in the front. Like so future privacy would take a big block of everybody's jobs and functions. And apart from that, I think there would be a reduction in the technology stack and the information security stack and the governance and oversight, because right now, if you go back to on-prem kind of environment, there were people who would do certain aspects of their job, cabling people, routing and networking people, OS patch management people, racking people. But now you can do that. While we've finished this conversation in an hour, we could actually have a data center in 3 different places in the world, multi-region, right? Fully functional. And the 3 of us could have developed it, not me, probably Spencer and you. But I think that reduction in stack would allow more nimble approach to the business, because business doesn't have to jump through multiple layers, and that reduction in stack would help. The entities that will actually help the reduction in stack would be people who understand different subjects relatively well, rather than knowing just coding or just information security or just load balancing or just routing and switching. They would need to understand the entire stack through and through. I also believe that one of the larger areas would become, because business would have approach to technologies sooner, quicker, and faster, and they would want to have their hands dirty because they are the people who understand the business itself, and there's a reduction in the stack. I think the bigger thing would become oversight and governance component, where some entity would have that oversight and governance rather than actually telling business how to do technology, because that has been exposed to business now, right? Through the use of DevOps, DevSecOps, automated pipelines, cloud itself, right? So I think all these little things will come into play.
Yeah, Spencer, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the future is everything becomes software, right? So we look at more and more of what, especially if you're already in the cloud, you've got infrastructure as code as a dev team, like you're still in code. Everything is becoming software that humans are writing that is prone to error. And so having a mentality of how can we add validations? It's going to be like that. That's going to take off. We're going to become more and more focused on adding things into the developer experience and developer broadly to include like infrastructure folks.
Yeah.
How can you include basic checks like guardrails, whatever you want to, the buzzword for those are, including those and getting better at detection. That's going to take off because that is where we're going. Those are the products that people are going to be adopting, migrating towards, and are probably going to have the best value of return, because most traditional security controls, they were, you had an IDS. Well, what if your network is no longer yours and you're up in AWS and like you can't drop a layer 2 sniffer anymore? Like there's no concept of span tap ports. So what are you going to do? You're going to change to different areas. You're going to be diverging those security controls to your trusted third parties. And you're going to be focused on the things that you now control, which you control the code that's going into these apps, the things that you are deploying into the cloud. So I think that's going to be a big driver in making sure that we've got good security controls for the people and for the code that we're writing. That's going to become extremely important. I like Dhruv's answer around governance too, because just like everything is becoming software and we're moving away from like you need to have a firewall in PCI DSS. The people are going to have less things to govern that were traditional, tried and true, like bare metal type concepts, and they're going to become more process focused. They're going to become more software focused, right? So show me your process for your CI pipeline. Is it documented? Do you detect anything that's going around that process? Show me the controls around that flow, because now that is more important than, well, I built a data center and I stuck a firewall on the edge and I'm good now. I think those types of concepts are going to have to change. What I'm curious of is how fast it's going to happen. Because we know if you look at like the breakdown of personnel, the people and the skill set that exists within the audit governance area is normally lagging behind what is existing in the engineering space, right? Mm-hmm. Which, for better or for worse, and there's probably some great technologists that are on the governance side, but that's kind of the general trend. It takes them a while to get there. I'm super curious to see like what happens when governance catches up with Kubernetes and taking those concepts and applying it in a Kubernetes world, right? How long is it going to take us to get there, and what's that going to look like?
Yeah,
I'm super interested to see like what does the CNCF come up with, and how do we start putting together a framework of like this is what we're going to do, and get away from those like you have to buy this product to become compliant.
Yeah, it's interesting. As we talk about the whole dev pipeline concept, I was just having a conversation earlier with someone, and the idea of injecting even legal now into the dev pipeline, something that we may not have even thought about previously, right? But the legal folks are beginning to now understand data models and schemas. And why is it important for the legal team? It's because of privacy. right? Can you actually help me understand whether we are protecting ourselves, or are we masking the right things, you know, in terms of the legal obligations we've got with identifiable information, for example? And, you know, now with sort of the balkanization of what's happening globally, we've got all these standards, to what Dhruv was mentioning, you know, around the world. Are we in fact in legal, you know, compliance with all this stuff that's kind of going on? So, and in the midst of all of this, as we are pushing code out, there is now pressure to make sure that everything that we're pushing out also is adherent to all of these policies that are out there. And because we're moving so quickly, this idea of continuous everything is sort of emerging. Not emerging, it's been around for a while, but we're beginning to see the operationalization of that now. So how can we make sure that as we're going through this, and we've got these data sets from the tools that are emerging that we can provide to the legal team now, to the compliance team, to the auditors, to the regulators, you know, without really disrupting the business operations. And so this is kind of the next stage. And in some of the work that I'm doing with, for example, the Open Group, it's focused really on the business operations now, right? In a world where things are digital, where historically maybe we've produced a compliance report as a physical document, now it's entirely possible to have that transferred as digital assets that you now integrate with another system. And trying to integrate these various domains with their terminology, with their own sort of taxonomies and all this stuff, you know, while trying to maintain privacy and security, I think is going to be the next stage of how we start to see this evolve at the enterprise level, which is consistent with making it so that security is just a given now, you know, security, compliance, legal. So we've got all these various stakeholders now need to make sure that we've got alignment, you know, in terms of providing that that business value. So last thoughts before we open it up for Q&A. Dhruv, any final thoughts that maybe we haven't talked about that you think is important? And then I'll flip over to Spencer after you.
No, I think we've covered most of it. I really, what really did ring a bell with me was when Spencer mentioned the use of open source and tools and technologies. And, you know, it's always good to start with tools and technologies that exist. And guess what? A lot of freeware and shareware and open source tools exist. One of my favorite, and I generally don't try to bring vendors into the picture, never, but Aqua Security, because Spencer mentioned Kubernetes and stuff. But a lot of organizations have started using Aqua Security, which is available on GitHub for free, to do Kubernetes scanning. And it does as good a job. What it does not create are these fancy graphs and charts and colorful dashboards, but it gives you complete breakdown of what your Kubernetes environment is. And I think there are other such tools. So if you're a smaller organization and you're starting into your journey, you know, explore these tools. They are almost as good, if not better sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Spencer, your thoughts? Anything that we may not have covered that you wanted to inject in the conversation?
Yeah, no, I like Drew's comment, because like that's totally spot on. There's plenty of like awesome lists on GitHub that you can find of like these are technologies or open source products that exist to do like, a security control, and like kind of jumping in and getting your feet wet with those. I think the big gotcha is that normally, you know, when you go open source, there's normally an investment of human time. Where if you go commercial, you're paying somebody to take care of that problem for you. So it's, you know, it's kind of like the classic security management 101. It's what's that trade-off? What does your organization feel comfortable with? Do you have a budget for it? Is it something that you've got a person that is skilled in that particular domain? Like they understand how containers work and they understand how to build out a Docker file if you need to make modifications based off of Aqua's feedback. So it's all those things that kind of go into the mix to determine the control. But you know, there's no one way to skin the cat, and I'll be super curious to see like how compliance tries to deal with DevSecOps, because there's so many different things to worry about, or technologies to implement, or ways to do things, and a lot of them also end up being process related. So like we kind of talked about some data flow diagrams, threat modeling. I'm waiting for the day that somebody can click a button and generate the threat model for something. without any human interaction, just stick it in a pipeline and click go. Won't ever happen. But I think that is, those are things that you just, as you become a more mature organization, you get away from these click a button, get some results. You become more involved in the process and in the human element of designing this system, software, whatever it is. And that's where you level up, because it's pretty easy to do basic scanning. It's pretty easy to get those results. It is extremely hard to understand different ways that this feature that you're developing might be abused. Right? There's no tool that will say, oh, did you know that somebody's going to go try to spoof another user and be a really bad person today? Like, no, those things don't exist. So I think that'll be interesting to see how we develop and how we improve that friction, the time to do those things, et cetera. I'm super curious at how we're going to tackle that.
Fascinating, interesting. So at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Raquel. I don't know if there have been any questions or if we've run out of time at this point, but Raquel, I'd like to hand it over to you at this point.
Absolutely. So thank you so much again for another great webinar. Like Altaz mentioned, we're going to open it up to questions. We'll be able to get through just a couple, just seeing what time we have here. So one of the questions was, who owns the process of creating security controls?
Okay, so we talked about multiple stakeholders being involved with this. Spencer, who owns this?
So, I mean, my perspective, it's the CISO or your CRO, right? Like there's got to be some top level person has to own this thing forward. It doesn't mean they have to come up with it themselves. Like I would not expect a security team to come up with all of the security controls that need to be implemented, because there's shared ownership. But it definitely is extremely important that there is an owner, a person that is accountable for delivering on those controls, and that you've got buy-in to actually make it happen, whether that's political clout, that's a budget, et cetera. That person depends on your org. Some orgs don't even have a CRO. You might not even have a CISO. It might be a director, but understanding how to define those and get that person assigned and tasked, that's going to be extremely important in actually making those controls happen.
Yeah, Dhruv?
Same, exactly the same. Communicate with everybody. Everybody is responsible for providing input and identifying security controls. And if you have good communication and good interaction between each other, I think things become smoother. And exactly what Spencer mentioned, I'll tell.
Yeah, great. Raquel?
Perfect. So what happens when stakeholder perspectives change over time?
Stakeholder perspective. So business strategy changes, things like that can happen, right? What used to work before is no longer profitable. So we're going to move in a different direction. So we have to, upend everything at this point? How do we continue to stay aligned with what is happening with the business? I'll kind of put a couple of thoughts at the table. Offload some of my thoughts here. I think there needs to be a regular touch point with stakeholders. This is not a one and done kind of thing, but you have to keep at this so that you remain relevant, and the tools, the processes, the governance continues to offer that value back to the business. It's just a couple of thoughts for me, but Dhruv, your thoughts?
Yes, it's bound to happen. It will happen. What differentiates an organization, a successful organization, in regards to a not so successful one, is how quickly you can pivot. Yeah. So changes will happen. How quickly you percolate and inform about those changes and communicate about those changes and those changes in strategy would help you achieve your goals quicker and faster. And what cloud does is it actually allows, or what DevSecOps does is that actually allows you to quickly turn on a dime, to try out new things, and there's no cost to it. You know, you can play around with tools and technologies in a limited proof of concept. It doesn't work, you get rid of it. You clean up the environment, right? So I know that I've seen this time and time again, that people think that, we have to pivot so often and stuff like that. Yes, we will have to pivot often. You start off with one thing and then COVID hits you. Then what do you do?
Yeah.
You have to remain nimble. And the reason why human race has been so successful and so prevalent is because we can adapt. And the better at adaptation you are and changing quickly is going to define whether you're successful or not.
Spencer, final thoughts?
100%. Like, you have to adapt. I mean, as a security person, you should be adapting anyway, because we are not dealing with mainframes and AS400s anymore. So like, you have to adapt your controls just like we're adapting technology. Like, Kubernetes didn't exist 10 years ago. So does that mean like we don't need to secure it? Nope. We got to figure out how the heck does that Kubernetes actually work? What security controls do we need to put in place? Like, you just have to adapt. That's the nature of the game. But it's beautiful because that means job security. So take it with a grain of salt.
Raquel, back to you.
Awesome. Well, once again, thank you so much, Spencer, Dhruv, and Altaz, for another great session. Just to let everybody here know, we do have webinars lined up for the next few weeks. So if you are interested in attending any of these, please go to the upcoming events and webinars section of our website to sign up. Also, if you haven't heard, we have officially launched our podcast, The Balancing Act. So please make sure to check us out on Podbean, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. We hope everybody found this presentation insightful. And again, we will provide a link to the recording of this webinar to everyone here via email. Thank you again for attending. Stay safe, and I hope you have a great day.